The rain hammered against the grimy windows of the Eastwood Manor, a relentless drumbeat that matched the tension pulsing through the dimly lit drawing room. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old mahogany and something else, something faint, elusive, like perfume mingled with the bitter edge of fear. Dorothy Sayers stood by the fireplace, her sharp eyes scanning the scene with a disquieting calm that belied the chaos concealed beneath the surface. The body of Henry Caldwell, a man whose reputation in the city was as notorious as his charm, lay sprawled across the Persian rug, his lifeless eyes fixed on the ornate ceiling. His throat was neatly slit, yet no sign of struggle marred the scene. The windows were locked from the inside, the doors bolted, and the only key found clutched in Henry's cold hand. It was a tableau of precision, a murder seemingly committed without haste or error. The detectives assigned to the case were baffled. There were no footprints in the dust, no fingerprints beyond the victim's own, and no weapon to be found. But it was the clue lying beside the body that twisted the knife in their confusion, a single crimson feather. It wasn't the kind one would easily mistake for anything else, vibrant, delicate, and unmistakably from a bird not native to the city. Its presence was as incongruous as the crime itself. Detective Inspector Mallory had called Dorothy in when the case reached its dead end. She was a consultant known for her brilliant mind and an uncanny knack for seeing what others missed. As she knelt near the body, her fingers brushed the feather gently, her eyes narrowing in thought. There was something about it that seemed more than a simple calling card. It was a message, encrypted in color and texture, waiting to be deciphered. The manor was silent, save for the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional drip of rain from the eaves. Outside, the garden was a tangled mess of overgrown hedges and twisted branches, shadows lurking where light dared not linger. Dorothy stood and paced slowly, her thoughts weaving through the impossible scenario. A locked room murder, no suspect, no weapon, no apparent motive beyond lust and greed that Henry's life had been steeped in. Yet despite the overt simplicity, Dorothy sensed layers beneath the surface, a complexity masquerading as straightforward brutality. Henry was no stranger to enemies, nor to women who coveted him fiercely. His last known company was a private party in the manor's ballroom, a gathering that had included an enigmatic woman whose allure was whispered about in every corner of the city. They called her the Nympho, a nickname spoken with a mixture of fear and fascination. Her presence was said to twist men's desires into obsession, and Henry's end hinted that obsession might have turned deadly. The challenge was unraveling the tangled web of passion and betrayal concealed behind the manor's locked doors. Dorothy knew that every minute she delayed, the trail grew colder and the secrets more deeply buried. With a steady breath, she turned to the small group of officers lingering outside the drawing room and began piecing together the timeline, her mind a sharpening blade against the thick veil of mystery. Outside the windows, the storm raged on, a perfect backdrop for a crime that was anything but simple. The crimson feather was her first thread to pull, something from the past, perhaps, or a token left deliberately to mislead. Whoever had orchestrated this murder had planned it meticulously, hiding in plain sight. Dorothy's task was clear: to find the shadow lurking just beyond the edge of reason and bring it into the light. The night was young, but the secrets of Eastwood Manor were ancient, and they would not yield easily. Dorothy's gaze drifted toward the hearth, where the faint glow of embers cast flickering shadows over a collection of seemingly mundane objects: an overturned crystal decanter, a single white glove, and a small porcelain figurine shaped like a bird in mid-flight. The officers had passed these over without a second glance, their focus locked on the body and the obvious facts of the case. Yet Dorothy saw in these trivialities the whispers of a story untold. She crouched down to examine the porcelain bird. It was chipped, the delicate wing fractured at an unnatural angle, and dust clung to it in a pattern suggesting it had been moved recently. Too recently, for the layers of neglect that coated the rest of the room. The bird's outstretched wing pointed almost accusatorily toward the grand piano in the corner, its keys gleaming stark white in the dim light. Dorothy made a mental note. Something about the bird's placement seemed deliberate, a subtle marker left by someone who wanted to guide the investigator's eyes without overtly revealing their hand. As she straightened, the room's silence was punctuated by the hurried arrival of two uniformed officers escorting a young woman through the heavy oak door. Her hair was a cascade of dark curls, her eyes wide and rimmed with red. She clutched a delicate lace handkerchief tightly, as if it were a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. The officers introduced her as Evelyn Harrow, Henry Caldwell's secretary, and the last person known to have seen him alive. Dorothy studied Evelyn carefully. There was something about the woman's posture, a tension in her shoulders, a flicker of something beneath her controlled exterior, that hinted at more than grief. Evelyn's voice trembled as she recounted the evening, insisting she had left Henry in good spirits just hours before his death, that the party had been lively, and that Henry had excused himself early, retiring to the drawing room alone. But Dorothy's keen eye caught a slight hesitation when Evelyn mentioned the presence of a guest named Lillian, an attendee whose name was spoken with unusual caution. When pressed, Evelyn's composure faltered. She admitted that Lillian was a frequent visitor to the manor, a woman whose reputation preceded her, and whose influence over Henry had been the subject of whispered conversations. Dorothy knew immediately that Lillian was likely the elusive Nympho, the shadowy figure whose lust and cunning had left a trail of broken men in her wake. The detective's mind raced, piecing together the fragments, the crimson feather, the broken bird figurine, the veiled mention of Lillian, all threads woven into a tapestry of desire and deception. But there was more. Dorothy noticed faint smudges of lipstick on the edge of Henry's wine glass, a deep shade of crimson that matched neither Henry's usual taste nor Evelyn's pale lips. She asked to see the glass, holding it up to the light, the stain stark against the crystal's clarity. It was a small detail, but in Dorothy's experience, such minutiae often held the key. The officers had overlooked it in their procedural haste, but Dorothy's attention to these subtle clues breathed new life into the investigation. She questioned Evelyn gently about the feather, watching her closely for any sign of recognition or panic. Evelyn's eyes flickered briefly to the window, then back, before she confessed she had seen Lillian wearing a dramatic feathered boa at the party, a striking accessory that had drawn everyone's attention. The feather, then, was no random token, but a signature, a calling card left deliberately to send a message or to mock the authorities. Yet the most puzzling aspect remained. How had the killer managed to commit murder in a locked room without leaving a trace? Dorothy inspected the heavy oak door once more, tracing her fingers over the intricate carvings. There was a faint groove near the latch, a subtle imperfection that suggested the lock had been tampered with, though expertly so. This was no ordinary forced entry. It was the work of someone intimately familiar with the manor's secrets. As the rain continued its relentless assault, Dorothy's thoughts coalesced into a singular conclusion. The murderer was not an outsider, but someone within Henry's circle, someone who moved with the confidence of a predator and the precision of a surgeon. And that feather, vibrant and unmistakable, was a deliberate message meant to mislead or perhaps to challenge. Outside, the storm showed no sign of abating, but inside Eastwood Manor, the hunt for truth had only just begun. Dorothy's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. Every detail, every hesitation, every shadow held a secret, and she intended to uncover them all before the night was over. Dorothy gathered the small group of witnesses in the manor's drawing room, its grand windows streaked with rain and the fading light casting long shadows that danced uneasily on the walls. Each face reflected a different shade of tension, some cloaked in sorrow, others edged with something less innocent. She began with Evelyn, whose nervous glances betrayed the fragile composure she had maintained earlier. "Tell me again, Miss Harrow," Dorothy said softly, "about the last time you saw Mr. Caldwell." Evelyn swallowed hard, her fingers twisting the lace handkerchief into a tight knot. "It was just before midnight. The party was winding down. Mr. Caldwell said he needed some air, and I didn't think much of it. He was often restless during gatherings." Her voice cracked slightly, but her eyes darted toward the closed door, as if someone unseen awaited her confession. Dorothy nodded, then shifted her attention to Jonathan Pierce, Henry's business partner. A man of sharp features and colder eyes, Jonathan had remained silent until now, watching the scene with calculating detachment. "I was in the library," he said smoothly. "I didn't hear anything unusual. Henry was a shrewd man, but sometimes reckless. We argued earlier that evening about a deal gone wrong." He seemed agitated. "A deal gone wrong?" Dorothy prompted. Jonathan hesitated, then glanced toward Evelyn, as if seeking approval. "Yes, but I assure you it's irrelevant to his death." His tone was too polished, too rehearsed. Next came Margaret Caldwell, Henry's estranged wife. She arrived late, wrapped in a deep burgundy coat, her face pale, but eyes sharp as flint. "I hadn't seen Henry in months," she declared. "I only came to settle some final matters. I'm sorry to say I left before the murder occurred." Her voice held a bitter edge, but Dorothy detected a flicker of something more, reluctance, perhaps, or fear. Dorothy's gaze lingered on Margaret a moment longer, sensing a story beneath the cold surface. "You say you left early? Can anyone confirm that?" Margaret's eyes flashed defiantly. "My driver waited for me outside. You can ask him." She wouldn't elaborate. Then there was Lillian, the nympho herself, a striking woman with a presence that filled the room despite her composed demeanor. She wore a dress of midnight blue that clung to her slender frame, her lips painted the same shade as the crimson feather. "I admit," she said with a slow, knowing smile, "I was with Henry. But our encounter was nothing scandalous. He was a man who enjoyed life's pleasures, as do I. I left the manor well before midnight." Her voice was silky, but there was steel beneath it. Dorothy's eyes sharpened. "You say you left well before midnight, yet the feather found near the body matches your signature accessory. How do you explain that?" Lillian shrugged gracefully. "A memento, perhaps, or a message. But I assure you I am not the killer." The detective noted the subtle tension in Lillian's posture as she spoke. It was a dance of words and glances, a performance designed to sway and deflect. Yet Dorothy's instincts told her that behind the alluring mask lay secrets carefully guarded. As the questioning unfolded, contradictions began to surface. Evelyn insisted she never left the drawing room after Henry retreated there, yet a maid reported seeing her near the ballroom's side entrance shortly after the murder time. Jonathan claimed to be in the library alone, but a butler mentioned hearing raised voices coming from the same direction. Margaret's driver was mysteriously unavailable for comment, and Lillian's alibi rested solely on her own assurance. Dorothy observed carefully how each person reacted to the probing questions. Evelyn's eagerness to cooperate bordered on desperation, as if she feared what might happen if she withheld information. Jonathan's controlled detachment seemed a thin veneer, brittle and prone to crack under pressure. Margaret's guarded hostility suggested old wounds that had not healed, perhaps festering resentment. And Lillian, oh Lillian, her calm was a weapon, concealing as much as it revealed. The detective's mind sifted through the conflicting testimonies, weaving patterns from the tangled threads. Each story contained grains of truth, but also lies crafted to protect hidden motives. The feather, the broken figurine, the locked room, it all pointed to a crime born not just of lust and betrayal, but something deeper, a web of manipulation where everyone had a role to play. As the night deepened and the storm outside began to wane, Dorothy stepped back and surveyed the room. The witnesses were no longer just sources of information. They were players in a game of shadows, their voices layered with deception. She would need more than words to uncover the truth. She would need to see beyond the facades, to find the cracks where the real story hid. For now, the answers remained just out of reach, tangled in the voices of deception that filled the manor. But Dorothy Sayers knew one thing: every lie carried a weight, and every secret left a trace. It was only a matter of time before those traces led her to the heart of the mystery. Dorothy stood alone by the rain-streaked window, the remnants of the storm casting a muted grey pallor over Eastwood Manor. The house was still heavy with the residue of tension, the hushed whispers, the furtive glances, the carefully curated facades. She closed her eyes briefly and let her thoughts settle, weaving through the strands of information gathered. Each suspect carried a motive potent enough to kill, yet none fit neatly into a single, cohesive picture. The puzzle was more labyrinthine than she had first imagined. Henry Caldwell had been a man who thrived on power and influence, his life a chessboard where every move was calculated. His enemies were many, his passions volatile. Greed was the most obvious thread. Jonathan Pierce, the cold-eyed business partner, had openly quarreled with Henry over a failing deal. The argument had been fierce enough to make the staff uneasy, and Jonathan's thinly veiled resentment was clear. Financial ruin loomed for him if Henry pulled out or turned against their joint ventures. But would that be enough to orchestrate such a meticulously planned murder in the very heart of the manor? Dorothy was unconvinced, especially given Jonathan's careful alibi and his overt desire to distance himself from the crime. Then there was Margaret, Henry's estranged wife, whose bitterness was as palpable as the storm outside. The separation had been acrimonious, and rumors of betrayal and infidelity had poisoned what once may have been love. Her return to settle final matters was suspiciously timed, and Dorothy noted the sharpness in her voice whenever she spoke of Henry. Was this a calculated move to secure her own interests, or something darker? Revenge, perhaps, fueled by years of humiliation and heartbreak? But Margaret's claim of leaving early, coupled with the absence of her driver for confirmation, cast a shadow of doubt, raising more questions than answers. Evelyn Harrow, the secretary, was another piece of the maze. She was young, visibly shaken, but strangely eager to help, almost too eager. Her shifting statements and fleeting looks betrayed anxiety that suggested secrets deeper than mere grief. Had she been privy to something more intimate? Or was she herself ensnared in Henry's dangerous games? The sighting of her near the ballroom after her stated departure time raised a flag. Dorothy considered whether Evelyn's nervousness stemmed from guilt, fear, or knowledge she was reluctant to share. And then Lillian, the enigmatic nympho who seemed both the key and the greatest red herring. Her allure was legendary, her control over those who crossed her path nearly hypnotic. The crimson feather was her unmistakable signature, a mark that taunted the authorities and suggested her involvement. But her calm, poised demeanor and carefully constructed alibi complicated matters. She admitted to being with Henry but denied any scandalous act or murderous intent. Was she truly innocent, or the puppeteer pulling strings from behind a veil of seduction and manipulation? Dorothy began cross-referencing alibis, looking for cracks or overlaps. Jonathan's claim of solitude in the library was contradicted by a butler who overheard raised voices, possibly a heated exchange involving Henry. Could Jonathan have confronted Henry violently, only to retreat before the murder? Margaret's driver was conveniently unreachable, but servants reported seeing her carriage leaving late in the evening after the estimated time of death, suggesting she might have stayed longer than she admitted. Evelyn's movements near the ballroom hinted at clandestine meetings or overheard conversations, and Lillian's feathered boa, a flamboyant statement, might have been deliberately left behind to misdirect. Beneath all these motives lay the shadow of fear of exposure, of loss, of ruin. Henry's lifestyle was a tinderbox of secrets waiting to ignite. Dorothy contemplated the broken porcelain bird found near the body, its fractured wing symbolic. Was it a message of broken trust or a warning? The bird had been placed carefully, yet its damage was recent, a silent scream in porcelain. As she sat at the large oak table in the study, surrounded by notes and scribbled timelines, Dorothy's mind moved like a blade through the fog. The tangled web of lust, jealousy, greed, and revenge was not a simple knot to untie. It was a labyrinth where every path led to more questions. She needed to find the thread that connected them all, the motive that encompassed not just opportunity, but the desire to kill. Her instincts whispered that the truth was hidden in the interplay of relationships, the power struggles beneath the surface, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, the subtle manipulations cloaked in charm and deceit. Each suspect was a piece of a larger mosaic, and only by understanding their connections and contradictions could she reveal the face of the murderer. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the manor wrapped in a cold, uneasy silence. Dorothy rose from her chair, resolve hardening within her. She would dig deeper into their pasts, pry into the corners they wished to keep dark, and follow every thread, no matter how twisted. The motive maze was complex, but it was not impenetrable. The killer's desire to conceal themselves was matched only by Dorothy's determination to expose the truth. Tonight, the shadows of Eastwood Manor held their breath. Tomorrow they would speak. The morning light seeped through the heavy drapes of Eastwood Manor, casting a pale glow over the restless household. The atmosphere had shifted overnight, from somber tension to a brittle hope. News had broken that the police had found what they claimed was the key to the entire murder. A discarded knife, smeared with traces of blood and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the ballroom, had been discovered by a junior constable during a routine search. It was the kind of breakthrough the public craved, a tangible object to hang the weight of guilt upon. Detective Inspector Mallory, flushed with excitement, wasted no time. The knife was presented to the assembled household and press with theatrical certainty. "We have the murder weapon," he declared, eyes gleaming. "And preliminary analysis confirms the blood is Henry Caldwell's. We expect to make an arrest within hours." The room stirred with murmurs, eyes darting nervously among the suspects, as if any one of them might be the next to fall. But Dorothy Sayers, standing slightly apart from the crowd, felt the familiar tightening in her chest that signaled unease. The evidence was too neat, too convenient. The knife itself was crude and unfamiliar, not the kind Henry would have possessed, nor one fitting the precision of the wound. And its discovery, so fortuitous and timed to the minute, reeked of orchestration. Dorothy's mind churned beneath the surface, sorting through the known facts and probing the inconsistencies. She sought out Evelyn first, finding her in the servants' quarters, pale and trembling. "Did you see anyone near the ballroom last night?" Dorothy asked quietly. Evelyn shook her head, her eyes wide. "No, I swear. I was in the drawing room most of the evening, except for a moment when I fetched Henry's drink." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Evelyn hesitated, then whispered, "There was a man, someone I didn't recognize. He slipped in just before midnight, but he left quickly after Henry went to the drawing room." A chill ran down Dorothy's spine. The man was not among the known suspects. She pressed further, but Evelyn's fear silenced her words. Dorothy turned next to Jonathan, who wore a forced smile, his eyes sharper than before. "Where were you when the knife was supposedly hidden?" "In my study, reviewing accounts," he said smoothly. "I had no reason to enter the ballroom after the guests dispersed." Dorothy watched him closely, noting the slight twitch of his fingers. Margaret was conspicuously absent from the morning's proceedings. When Dorothy tracked her to the garden, she found the woman pacing, her expression unreadable. "You didn't attend this morning's gathering," Dorothy observed. Margaret's laugh was bitter. "And what good would it do? They think they have the killer already. I prefer to watch the charade from afar." "What do you make of the knife?" Margaret's gaze hardened. "A plant. A distraction. Someone wants to wrap this up quickly, but I doubt it's the truth." Lillian, meanwhile, remained a study in controlled calm. Dorothy found her seated in the drawing room, fingers tracing patterns on the armrest. "What do you think of this breakthrough?" she asked. Lillian's smile was thin and practiced. "It suits some to believe the case is closed. But truth, dear detective, has a way of slipping through the cracks." Dorothy's instinct screamed that the case was far from over. The knife was a false trophy, a staged victory meant to deceive. Yet the authorities were eager to seize it, to close the file and move on. She alone felt the weight of unanswered questions pressing heavily against her mind. Later that day, as she retraced the steps through the manor, Dorothy's sharp eyes caught a faint smudge on the underside of the ballroom's grand piano, a smear of dark lipstick, the same shade as the feather and the stain on Henry's glass. It was almost invisible, easily overlooked by anyone but her. And there, partially hidden beneath a chair, was a small, torn piece of fabric matching the pattern of Lillian's dress. The evidence was circumstantial, but it spoke volumes. It suggested a presence near the scene, later than anyone admitted, a moment when the killer had slipped in and out, unseen. Dorothy's mind raced. If the knife was planted, then the real weapon and the true killer remained hidden, their shadow stretching over the manor like a dark promise. She knew she had to act swiftly, before the veneer of resolution became cemented. The killer was watching, waiting for the moment to strike again or to vanish entirely. As dusk fell and the manor's lights flickered on against the encroaching night, Dorothy stood poised between revelation and danger. The case was not solved, it was only beginning. Dorothy sat at the heavy oak desk in the manor's dimly lit study, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of aged paper. Her fingers traced the spines of old ledgers and yellowed newspapers she had pulled from the estate's neglected library, a collection of history long forgotten by the bustling city outside. Something in the tangled motives and shifting alibis tugged at her mind, a faint whisper of familiarity she couldn't yet place. It was a brittle headline from a decade past that finally caught her eye. "Scandal rocks Eastwood Manor, missing heiress and mysterious disappearance." The faded article detailed a young woman named Evelyn Harrow. No, not the secretary before her now, but an older Evelyn Harrow, once the heiress to the Eastwood fortune, who vanished without a trace. The case had gone cold, dismissed by many as a runaway or worse. Dorothy's pulse quickened. The coincidence was too stark to ignore. She pulled out a brittle folder from beneath the stack, its edges frayed with time. Inside, the photographs and testimonies painted a picture of intrigue, betrayal, and desperation, not unlike the current one. A tangled family feud, whispered debts, and a secret lover who disappeared the night Evelyn vanished. The parallels were unsettling. Dorothy's thoughts shifted back to the present, Evelyn Harrow, the secretary. The woman was younger, but the name, the connection to Eastwood Manor, the nervous demeanor, it all hinted at a lineage intertwined with this shadowed past. A family secret had been hiding in plain sight. Her fingers then landed on another file, this one marked with a different name, Jonathan Pierce. A brief mention revealed his father had been a trusted advisor to the Eastwood family, but had died under suspicious circumstances years before. The advisor's death had been quietly recorded as an accident, but whispers of foul play had circulated in hushed corners. Dorothy pieced it together. Jonathan's family had long-standing ties to the manor, connections that went beyond business. His father's death had left a wound in those alliances, a seed of bitterness that Jonathan carried silently. Could his quarrel with Henry have roots deeper than financial dispute? Was the present conflict the latest chapter in a story decades in the making? The thought sent Dorothy hunting through correspondence and personal journals tucked away in the manor's forgotten drawers. Letters between the Eastwoods and the Pierces revealed alliances, betrayals, and promises broken. And then, hidden beneath a false bottom in a drawer, she found a faded photograph, Evelyn Harrow, then a young woman standing beside Lillian, both smiling with an intimacy that spoke of friendship or conspiracy. Lillian, the mysterious nympho, was no mere outsider. She was part of this old tapestry, her presence woven into the manor's history far longer than anyone had suspected. Dorothy's mind raced. The murder was not an isolated act born of lust or greed alone. It was the eruption of long-simmering tensions, resentments, and dark secrets that had been buried beneath generations of privilege and deceit. She recalled a passage in one of the journals, an entry made late at night, cryptic and urgent, speaking of a betrayal that would break the house. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably Henry's. Had he known too much? Had he threatened to unearth truths some wanted left forgotten? The connections between Evelyn, Jonathan, and Lillian painted a new portrait, a trio bound by history, each carrying their own scars and motives shaped by the past's long shadow. Their interactions were not merely coincidental, but part of a carefully guarded dance around the manor's buried skeletons. Dorothy realized the crime had to be understood as both present and past, a violent punctuation in a narrative that spanned years. To unravel the mystery, she would have to confront the ghosts lingering in Eastwood Manor's halls, forcing the players to reveal the truths they had hidden beneath masks of civility. She rose from the desk, determination settling like steel in her spine. The past was no longer a silent spectator, it was an active participant in the deadly game. Dorothy would have to unearth it fully if she was to bring justice to light, and survive the revelations that awaited. Outside, the manor groaned softly as the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of secrets long kept, but never truly silent. Dorothy stood in the heart of Eastwood Manor's grand drawing room, the air thick with expectation and the faint scent of fading perfume. The day had stretched long, the weight of secrets pressing heavier with every passing hour. Conventional questioning had yielded nothing but carefully crafted lies and half-truths. It was time to try a different approach, one that would peel back the layers of deceit, not through interrogation, but through subtle manipulation of perception. She had long admired the power of suggestion and the subtle art of reading between the lines, of watching not just what was said, but what remained unspoken. With that in mind, Dorothy arranged the suspects in a circle, each seated and seemingly calm, though shadows flickered behind their eyes. "I want to try something different," she began, her voice steady but inviting. "It's a simple exercise in honesty. I will describe a series of objects and emotions, and I ask you to respond with the first word or thought that comes to mind. No overthinking, no filtering, just instinct." Room fell silent, eyes shifting nervously. Dorothy started with innocuous prompts. River. Winter. Light. Gauging each reaction carefully, subtle twitches, changes in posture, fleeting expressions that spoke louder than words. When she reached feather, the change was immediate and undeniable. Evelyn's fingers clenched tightly on the edge of her seat, knuckles whitening. Her breath caught. For a brief moment, the fragile mask of composure slipped, revealing a flash of panic. Dorothy's gaze lingered. "Tell me, Evelyn," she said softly, "what do you associate with a feather?" Evelyn hesitated, then whispered, "Freedom, flight, escape." "Interesting," Dorothy replied. "And yet here we have a feather, crimson and striking, a mark left deliberately at a crime scene. How does that sit with your sense of freedom?" Before Evelyn could answer, Dorothy turned to Lillian, whose smile remained a practiced shield. "And you, Miss Lillian, what does the feather mean to you?" Lillian's eyes darkened, the glint of a challenge sparking. "It is a symbol of allure, of danger wrapped in beauty. A warning, perhaps." Dorothy nodded thoughtfully, then pivoted to Jonathan. "And you, Mr. Pierce?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "A trivial token, easily overlooked but not meaningless." Margaret shifted uneasily. "A feather can be light, but it can also mark a path or a target." Dorothy smiled faintly. Each reaction was a puzzle piece, but Evelyn's had the edge of genuine fear. That crack in her armor was a whisper that begged attention. To press further, Dorothy introduced an old scientific technique, a simple test of memory and stress. She placed a small mirror on the table and asked each suspect to look into it and recall the details of the evening's events aloud while she observed their eyes and subtle micro-expressions. Stress and deception, she knew, often betrayed themselves there. When it came to Evelyn, the effect was profound. Her voice wavered, and her eyes darted repeatedly away from the mirror's reflection. She stumbled over minor details, a misremembered arrival time, a forgotten conversation, small discrepancies that, though seemingly innocent, hinted at deeper concealment. Dorothy's instincts screamed that Evelyn was hiding something critical, something that tied her more closely to the crime than she dared admit. She chose her next words with care. "Miss Harrow, if you could say one thing to the person who killed Mr. Caldwell, what would it be?" Evelyn's lips trembled. After a long pause, she whispered, "Why did you have to make me part of this?" "I didn't want it to end this way." The confession hung in the air, fragile yet heavy. Dorothy's mind raced. Evelyn's fear, her panicked reaction to the feather, and now this cryptic plea all pointed to involvement far more complicated than mere witness or bystander. The other suspects watched with varied expressions, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled concern. Dorothy realized that by turning the investigation inward, away from hard evidence and into the realm of psychology, she had struck a nerve. The truth, elusive and masked, was beginning to show faint outlines. The detective rose, breaking the silence. "Thank you all. The night is far from over, and there is much more to uncover. But sometimes it is not the loudest voice that tells the story. It is the quiet tremble beneath. As she stepped away, Dorothy knew the game had changed. The shadows were shifting, and somewhere within them, the killer's carefully constructed facade was starting to crumble. The manor's dim corridors hummed with restless energy as Dorothy made her way toward the evidence room, a small chamber tucked behind the main staircase where all collected items from the investigation were kept under lock and key. The morning's revelations had breathed new urgency into the case, and Dorothy intended to examine the crimson feather once more, the thread that seemed to bind the tangled web of lies and motives. But when she reached the heavy oak door, her fingers paused on the cold brass handle. The lock, which should have been secure, was slightly ajar. A jarring sense of unease prickled her skin. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside to find the room in disarray. Drawers yawned open, papers scattered like fallen leaves, and the small evidence box that should have contained the feather sat empty on the floor. Dorothy's heart tightened. The feather gone. Her mind raced. Who had the access and the audacity to tamper with evidence in the very heart of the manor? The implications were grim. Someone was desperate to derail the investigation, to bury the truth before it could be unearthed. She hurried from the room and summoned Inspector Mallory and the senior officers. Their faces mirrored her shock, but there was a flicker of defensiveness as well. "This is a serious breach," Dorothy said, voice steady but edged with steel. "The feather was crucial. We cannot allow this obstruction to go unanswered." Mallory nodded grimly. "I'll tighten security immediately. No one leaves or enters without clearance, but it's possible the culprit is among us." That chilling possibility sent ripples through Dorothy's thoughts. The enemy was closer than anyone had dared suspect. She revisited the suspects, her eyes sharper than ever. Evelyn's pale face bore the strain of sleepless nights. Jonathan's cool detachment seemed more brittle. Margaret's sharp retorts grew defensive. And Lillian's poised facade concealed a flicker of something darker. Dorothy found herself questioning the very walls of Eastwood Manor, which now seemed to pulse with silent conspiracies. She requested the staff logs, scrutinized the entries for inconsistencies. One name stood out, a recently hired housekeeper, Clara, whose shifts coincided with gaps in the manor's surveillance. When confronted, Clara faltered, then confessed to seeing Lillian near the evidence room late last night. Dorothy arranged a discreet confrontation. Lillian entered the study with that practiced grace, but Dorothy's direct gaze unsettled her. "You were near the evidence room last night," Dorothy stated calmly. "Why?" Lillian's smile thinned. "Curiosity. The truth interests me as much as anyone. But curiosity does not grant you access to locked evidence," Dorothy pressed, "especially when crucial items go missing." Lillian's composure cracked for a moment, a flicker of frustration or fear. "You think I'm the murderer or the saboteur?" "Neither," Dorothy replied evenly. "But someone is trying to cloud the waters, and I intend to clear them." The conversation left more questions than answers, but Dorothy sensed she was closing in. Back in the drawing room, she pondered the vanishing feather and the growing shadow that threatened to engulf the case. The killer was not merely hiding behind lies, they were fighting back, willing to sabotage justice itself. Trust was a fragile commodity now. Allies could be enemies, and truth a shifting mirage. As night fell once more over Eastwood Manor, Dorothy steeled herself against the coming storm. The game had become deadly, not just for the victim, but for everyone who dared to seek the light. And somewhere, in the deepest shadows, the real culprit watched and waited. The quiet that had settled over Eastwood Manor was shattered in the early hours by a chilling scream that echoed through the labyrinthine halls like a knife slicing through fog. Dorothy was roused from a restless sleep by the frantic knocking on her door. It was Jonathan Pierce, his face pale and drawn, eyes wild with alarm. "Detective Sayers," he gasped. "There's been another incident. You need to come quickly." Dorothy pulled on a coat and followed him without hesitation, the urgency in his voice propelling her down the winding staircase and into the main corridor. Servants and staff scurried past them, whispering fearful rumors. The manor, once cloaked in tense stillness, now thrummed with nervous energy. They reached the east wing, where the door to the library stood ajar. Inside, the scene was grim. The body of Evelyn Harrow lay sprawled on the Persian carpet, her once pale face now marred by bruises and a look of terror frozen in death. A dark bruise encircled her neck, a clear sign of strangulation. Dorothy's heart clenched, but her mind sharpened immediately. This was no random act of violence. It was a message. The killer was still active, still watching, and now more dangerous than ever. The discovery sent shockwaves through the household. The fragile veil that had been thinning now tore completely. The suspect's earlier stories seemed hollow in the face of this brutal new act. Dorothy stepped into the center of the growing storm, the weight of responsibility settling firmly on her shoulders. This was no longer just a quest for answers, it was a race against time to prevent further bloodshed. She gathered the remaining suspects, Jonathan, Margaret, and Lillian, under close watch. Each wore the pallor of shock, but Dorothy could detect the quickening pulse of fear beneath their calm. Questions surged like a torrent. Had Evelyn confided anything before her death? Had she uncovered a secret too dangerous? Was her demise a punishment or a desperate act to silence her? Dorothy recalled Evelyn's earlier cryptic words, the plea to the killer, the terrified hesitations during the psychological test. The young woman had been ensnared deeper than anyone had realized. The detective ordered a meticulous search of Evelyn's quarters. Among her belongings, she found a small, folded letter addressed to Dorothy, written in hurried script. "They are closer than you know. Trust no one." The feather was only the beginning. The note was a grim confirmation. The killer was playing a long game, weaving fear and manipulation to stay steps ahead. Dorothy felt a cold resolve harden within her. The investigation's trajectory had shifted. She was no longer merely piecing together a past crime, but navigating a present menace that could strike again at any moment. She intensified surveillance, tightened security, and scrutinized every interaction with renewed suspicion. Every glance, every whispered word could hold a clue or a threat. The game had become deadly chess, and the killer was a master strategist, always anticipating her moves. Yet Dorothy remained undeterred. The manor's shadows might lengthen, but she was determined to shine a light into every corner, no matter how dark. As the storm clouds gathered once more outside, the detective prepared for the perilous path ahead. The villain was still at large, weaving their sinister dance, but Dorothy Sayers was ready to follow the twisted trail, wherever it might lead. Dorothy sat alone in the quiet of the manor's library, the weight of the recent tragedies pressing heavily upon her. The house felt like a cage, its walls whispering secrets she had yet to decipher. But amid the swirling chaos of deaths, stolen evidence, and fractured alibis, a fragile thread began to unravel, leading her closer to the heart of the mystery. Her eyes drifted over the scattered notes and timelines pinned to the corkboard. Faces, places, times, and fragments of conversations meticulously arranged like pieces of a fragile mosaic. She mulled over each suspect's behavior, their subtle mannerisms, and the inconsistencies that had once seemed mere oddities, but now took on greater significance. One detail in particular returned again and again to her mind: the broken porcelain bird found near Henry Caldwell's body. At first glance, it was an insignificant trinket, a simple decorative piece cracked by chance. But the more Dorothy considered it, the more its symbolism felt deliberate. She recalled how the bird's wing was snapped at a precise angle and how its placement seemed to point toward the piano in the drawing room. Yet no one had mentioned any connection between the victim and that instrument. Then a faint memory flickered. During her first questioning, Jonathan Pierce had mentioned Henry's fondness for playing the piano, describing how the music soothed his restless mind during times of stress. Dorothy realized that the bird's broken wing could symbolize a silencing, an intentional destruction of something that once brought peace. Her gaze shifted to the grand piano itself, its glossy black surface gleaming beneath the chandelier's dim light. She rose and approached, fingers brushing over the keys. Something about the piano had unsettled her from the start. An object so central to the manor yet strangely neglected in the investigation. As her eyes roamed the room, she spotted a faint smudge on the polished surface, a trace of dark lipstick matching the stain on Henry's glass and the elusive crimson feather. It was subtle, easily overlooked, but Dorothy's keen eye caught it immediately. The lipstick mark was not a casual imprint, but the residue of a hurried kiss, the kind that carried both passion and desperation. Piecing these clues together, Dorothy considered the suspects once more. Lillian, with her signature crimson feather and commanding presence, was known for her intoxicating allure. Could she have used her charms to approach Henry at the piano, perhaps to confront or seduce him in a final, fatal moment? But there was more. Dorothy recalled a casual comment from Evelyn during their first meeting, a fleeting mention of a secret meeting planned at the piano just before the murder. Evelyn had brushed over it nervously as if reluctant to speak. The detective's mind raced. Was the piano the true stage of the crime? Had the struggle that ended Henry's life begun there, shrouded in music and passion? Dorothy cross-referenced the timelines again. The brief window when Henry was alone in the drawing room, the sudden appearance of the feather near the body, and the lipstick smudge on the piano, all converged into a single, coherent scene. Suddenly, another detail clicked into place. During the psychological exercise, Evelyn's panicked reaction to the word feather now took on new meaning. The feather was not just a calling card, but a symbol of control and possession, perhaps marking the victim as belonging to someone dangerous. Dorothy gathered the remaining suspects in the drawing room once more, her voice calm but resolute. She laid out the pattern that had emerged: the broken bird, the piano, the lipstick smudge, and the feather, all elements of a carefully choreographed narrative designed to mislead and yet reveal. Her eyes locked onto Lillian, whose composure flickered for the first time. The tension in the room thickened as Dorothy's words peeled away, the layers of deception. "The killer is someone who used passion as a weapon," Dorothy declared. "They orchestrated the scene with symbols meant to confuse, but also to communicate." Lillian's lips curled into a thin smile. "You think you understand the game, detective, but you have yet to see the full board." Dorothy's gaze hardened. "I see enough to know the truth has been hiding in plain sight, masked by desire and lies." As the suspects exchanged uneasy glances, Dorothy felt the momentum shift. The pieces were aligning, the pattern crystallizing into clarity. The shadows that had clouded the manor were beginning to recede, and the path to justice was finally within reach. Outside, the night deepened, but inside Eastwood Manor, the long game was ending. Dorothy Sayers was ready to deliver the final move. The gathering in the drawing room was taut with tension, as Dorothy's steady gaze swept across the faces before her, each one a mosaic of fear, defiance, and secrets barely contained. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. The moment for truth had arrived, though none could predict how far down the rabbit hole they would be plunged. Dorothy began softly. "We've uncovered much: greed, jealousy, fear. But none of these motives alone explain the depth of violence we have witnessed. The truth lies beyond the surface, hidden beneath layers of carefully crafted lies." Her eyes settled on Jonathan Pierce, whose usually unflappable demeanor now showed a flicker of unease. Dorothy pressed on. "Jonathan, your family's history with the Eastwoods is long and complicated. Your father's death was more than an accident. It was a wound left open, festering in silence. You sought justice, or perhaps vengeance. But it wasn't merely business that drove you." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I did what I had to. Henry's recklessness threatened everything I worked for. He needed to be stopped." "But there's more," Dorothy said. "Something you've not confessed, something personal." Jonathan's eyes flickered toward Lillian, then away. You wouldn't understand." Turning to Lillian, Dorothy's voice lowered. "And you, Miss Lillian, with your feather and your elegance. Your role is not that of a mere seductress. You wield control like a blade, cutting through facades. But your attachment to Henry was more than superficial." Lillian's smile was thin, almost predatory. "Henry was a man who drew me in with promises he never kept. He destroyed more than business partnerships. He destroyed lives. I loved him and I hated him, but love is a dangerous thing." Dorothy nodded, then addressed Margaret Caldwell. "Margaret, you carry scars not just of a broken marriage, but of a life lived in shadow. Your bitterness is real, but beneath it lies a secret you guarded fiercely." Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Henry was cruel in ways the world never saw. But it's not revenge that drove me here." The room fell into a heavy silence. Dorothy's voice softened but carried an edge of finality. "The true motive behind these murders is not greed, not lust, nor mere revenge. It is fear, a primal, suffocating fear of exposure. Henry Caldwell was on the verge of unveiling a darkness that none wished to face." She paced slowly, letting her words sink in. "This darkness involved betrayal so deep it fractured families, destroyed reputations, and threatened to unravel the carefully constructed lives of all present. The murders were acts of desperation to silence the past before it could consume the present." Dorothy fixed her gaze on Evelyn, though now just a memory marked by tragedy. Evelyn Harrow's death was a final, tragic attempt to bury secrets that had been festering for years. She held knowledge that could shatter lives. Her fear was palpable, and it consumed her. Turning back, Dorothy's eyes sharpened. The killer is someone who feared not just losing power, but losing identity. Someone whose self was so entwined with lies that destruction was preferable to truth. A palpable shudder rippled through the room as the detective's revelation took hold. Jonathan broke first, voice heavy with confession. "I confronted Henry that night, yes, but it was Lillian who ended it. She couldn't bear the weight of what he was about to reveal. The feather, the staged scenes, they were her signature, her way of controlling the narrative." Lillian's face hardened, the elegant mask slipping momentarily. "I did what was necessary. Henry's truths would have destroyed us all, our histories, our futures. Sometimes survival demands sacrifice." Margaret nodded slowly. "We were all trapped in his web. Each of us had reasons to fear, to hate, to hope. But it was Lillian who decided the end." Dorothy's voice was firm. "The crime was not one of passion or greed alone. It was an act of psychological survival. The villain's mind was fractured by the terror of exposure, driving them to extremes no one else could comprehend. The room exhaled collectively, the veil of mystery lifting to reveal the human cost beneath. Dorothy stepped forward. Justice will be served, but let us remember the tangled roots of this tragedy, a story of fear and desperation that turned love and loyalty into weapons. Outside, the storm clouds that had haunted Eastwood Manor began to part, the first light of dawn breaking through. Inside, amidst the echoes of revelation, Dorothy Sayers stood resolute. The truth uncovered, the hidden motive revealed, and the shadows finally brought into the light. The grand drawing room was cloaked in the deep shadows of night, the flickering flames in the ornate fireplace casting wavering light on the faces gathered within. Dorothy Sayers stood poised near the hearth, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the taut tension that filled the space. Tonight was the moment she had been building toward, the final act in a play of deceit, passion, and murder. She had summoned Jonathan Pierce, Margaret Caldwell, and Lillian Harrow under the pretense of a reconciliation meeting, an effort to quell the restless tempers and suspicion that threatened to tear the household apart. But beneath the veneer of civility, Dorothy's mind was razor-sharp, every detail of the trap meticulously arranged. The flick of a hidden switch brought forth a soft hum from concealed speakers, and the room's lighting shifted subtly, bathing the suspects in an eerie glow. Dorothy's voice cut through the stillness, steady and commanding. Tonight, the truth can no longer hide behind shadows. The game is over. Jonathan's jaw clenched. Margaret's eyes darted nervously, but it was Lillian who met Dorothy's gaze with a cold, measured defiance. "You think you have me cornered, Detective?" Lillian's voice was smooth, but edged with steel. "I am many things, but I'm not a fool." Dorothy smiled slightly, her eyes never leaving Lillian's. "You are clever, Miss Harrow. Too clever to leave any loose ends. Yet even the most intricate web has its weak thread." She motioned toward a discreet device that projected recorded whispers, the fragmented voices of the household overheard and secretly recorded during the investigation. The voices revealed contradictions, secrets, and moments of hesitation that had once seemed innocuous. The recording paused, and Dorothy stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You crafted the staged scenes, the feather, the broken bird. You manipulated fear, passion, and loyalty like a conductor, but in doing so, you underestimated the one constant, the desire for truth." Lillian's facade flickered. Heartbeat, vulnerability flashed across her face, quickly masked by anger. "Henry Caldwell was a ruinous force, and I was protecting what remained," Lillian confessed, voice trembling slightly. "But I did not kill Evelyn. That was not my doing." Dorothy's eyes narrowed. "Then who?" The room held its breath as Jonathan spoke, voice rough with emotion. "It was me. I confronted Evelyn after she threatened to expose all of us. It got out of control." Margaret gasped, clutching her shawl. Lillian's eyes narrowed dangerously. Jonathan's confession hung heavy in the air, but Dorothy sensed it was incomplete. She pressed on. "And the knife planted in the ballroom, the stolen feather." Jonathan's gaze faltered. Lillian did that to protect herself, to divert attention. A tense silence followed. The tangled web of lies was unraveling, but the final truth still dangled tantalizingly out of reach. Suddenly, a sharp noise cut through the room. A shot fired from the shadows. The chandelier swayed, and a bullet lodged in the wall, inches from Dorothy's head. Chaos erupted. Lillian lunged toward the door, but Dorothy was faster, grabbing her wrist with iron grip. "You won't escape," Dorothy said calmly, her eyes blazing with conviction. The room stilled once more as the doors locked automatically, sealing the suspects inside. Breathing steadily, Dorothy looked around. The killer's mask was slipping. They were cornered. Lillian's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her as the weight of exposure settled. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "But the past demanded its price." Dorothy nodded, the final pieces clicking into place. The murders, the deceit, the desperate acts, all born from fear and tangled loyalties. As the first rays of dawn crept through the manor's tall windows, justice stood ready to claim its due. Dorothy Sayers had unmasked the villain, brought the shadows to light, and closed the chapter on Eastwood Manor's dark saga. The early morning light filtered weakly through the tall windows of Eastwood Manor's drawing room, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and curl like whispers from the past. The air was heavy with the residue of confessions, shattered alliances, and the brittle relief that justice had finally been served. Lillian Harrow sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, the weight of her actions etched deeply into her features. Jonathan and Margaret lingered nearby, their faces pale but relieved. Dorothy Sayers stood near the fireplace, the glow of the dying embers warming her stern expression. She allowed herself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. The tangled web of lies had been unraveled, the guilty unmasked, and the manor's dark legacy was, at last, beginning to breathe in the light of truth. But as with all shadows, some secrets refused to be fully illuminated. Just as Dorothy was about to adjourn the gathering, a sudden, soft tapping at the door interrupted the fragile peace. The butler, pale and visibly shaken, entered carrying a small, sealed envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the mantelpiece before retreating silently. Dorothy's eyes narrowed. The envelope was unmarked, its paper aged and delicate, the wax seal bearing the unmistakable crest of the Eastwood family, a symbol that commanded respect and whispered of long-held power. She broke the seal carefully, unfolding the letter within. Her breath caught as she read the elegant, precise handwriting. "Detective Sayers, you have uncovered much, but the truth you seek lies deeper still. You have been guided by shadows, but the light you need is hidden in plain sight. Look again to the past, for the architect of this tragedy is not who you believe." A chill swept through the room. The letter was unsigned, but its meaning was unmistakable. The case was far from closed. Dorothy's mind raced as she pieced together the implications. The orchestrator, the true mastermind, had remained in the background, pulling strings unseen, manipulating events with calculated precision. She turned to the assembled group, her voice calm but resolute. "It appears we have been deceived once more. This letter suggests that the person who set these deadly events in motion has not yet been revealed." Margaret gasped softly. "Who else could it be? We have already faced the worst among us." Jonathan shook his head slowly. "There must be someone we have overlooked. Someone with the power to manipulate us all." Dorothy's gaze drifted to the far corner of the room, where Evelyn's belongings had been quietly gathered. She stepped toward a small, locked cabinet, something she had dismissed earlier as irrelevant. Now curiosity and intuition compelled her forward. With a practiced hand, she found the hidden catch and opened the cabinet. Inside lay a worn leather journal, its pages filled with careful entries and cryptic notes. Dorothy's eyes scanned the pages rapidly. Among the mundane details of daily life, she found references to a figure previously unmentioned. Edward Eastwood, the reclusive elder brother of Henry Caldwell, thought to have died years ago in a foreign land. But here, in Evelyn's handwriting, was evidence suggesting Edward's survival and covert involvement in the family's affairs, a puppeteer whose silence had cast the longest shadow. The entries revealed a man consumed by bitterness and a desire to reclaim his lost heritage by any means necessary. Letters smuggled into the manor, secret meetings and coded messages hinted that Edward had engineered the fractures between Jonathan, Lillian and Margaret, manipulating each to serve his ends. Dorothy's breath caught as she pieced the truth together. Edward had orchestrated the entire tragedy from the shadows, driving his siblings to madness and murder to secure his own power and erase threats to his claim. She faced the group again, her voice steady but fierce. Edward Eastwood is alive. He is the true architect behind these crimes, the mastermind who hid behind others to achieve his goals. The room erupted into stunned silence, disbelief flickering in their eyes. A sudden noise from the hallway, footsteps approaching quickly, snapped Dorothy's attention to the door. It burst open, and a tall figure stepped inside, eyes cold and calculating. Edward Eastwood. His presence was as commanding as the secrets he carried. A twisted smile curved his lips. "So, detective," he said smoothly, "you have found my invitation to your little gathering." Dorothy's heart pounded, but her voice was unwavering. "Your reign of manipulation ends here, Edward." The final game had begun, a battle of wits and wills that would test every ounce of Dorothy's skill and resolve. In the flickering dawn, Eastwood Manor held its breath once more, the true darkness unveiled at last. The heavy silence that followed Edward Eastwood's sudden appearance in the drawing room was thick enough to suffocate. His gaze, sharp and cold as winter's edge, swept over the assembled group, lingering last on Dorothy. For a long moment, none dared speak. Each, weighed by the gravity of the revelation and the dangerous man who had so skillfully manipulated them all. Edward's smile was slow, deliberate. "You think you've unraveled my plans, Detective Sayers," he said, voice smooth, yet laced with menace. "But the game is far from over. I am not so easily captured." Dorothy stepped forward, eyes steady. "Your web of lies has been exposed, Edward. You twisted brotherhood into rivalry, trust into betrayal, but every thread leads back to you." He chuckled darkly, then with a sudden, swift motion, produced a small pistol from beneath his coat. The room erupted into chaos. Margaret screamed, Jonathan lunged forward, but Dorothy was already moving, instincts razor sharp. She dodged aside as the shot rang out, shattering a nearby window. "Enough," Dorothy said calmly, hands raised in a gesture of peace. "This isn't the way." Edward's eyes flashed with madness. "It's the only way to survive. If I fall, everything falls." Seconds stretched. Then a deafening crash. The chandelier, loosened by the gunfire, swung wildly, casting shards of glass and sparks. In the pandemonium, Edward darted toward a side door, disappearing into the labyrinth of corridors. "After him!" Jonathan shouted, but Dorothy held up a hand. "No," she said, voice resolute. "He wants us chasing shadows, but we have the truth." The manhunt that followed was frantic, but fruitless. Edward Eastwood vanished into the night, leaving behind only whispers and a chill of unfinished business. Later, in the quiet calm of the manor's study, Dorothy gathered the remaining pieces, ready to explain the subtle clues that had revealed the mastermind, and why Edward's escape, while frustrating, did not mean failure. She held up the broken porcelain bird. At first glance, this seemed an accident, but its precise fracture suggested a symbol, the silencing of a voice that once brought harmony. Only someone intimately familiar with Henry's habits would know to use such symbolism. Dorothy traced the lipstick smudge on the piano. A mark left not by chance, but to mislead. Lillian's crimson feather was another calculated signature, a sign of ownership and control. But the feather was a red herring, designed to focus suspicion away from the true puppet master. She tapped the leather-bound journal uncovered in Evelyn's belongings. And here, Evelyn's meticulous notes pointed to someone long believed dead, Edward Eastwood, his psychological warfare turned family against family, sowing discord until destruction was inevitable. Dorothy's eyes met those of Jonathan and Margaret, both wearied but attentive. Edward's brilliance was in his invisibility. He was the shadow behind the curtain, the silent hand steering chaos. His escape only delays justice, it does not deny it. Jonathan clenched his fists. "We'll find him, we have to." Dorothy nodded. "And we will. But for now, we honor the victims and keep the truth alive." As dawn broke over Eastwood Manor, casting light on the scars left behind, Dorothy allowed herself a rare moment of quiet reflection. The case was far from closed, the villain still at large, but the veil of mystery had been lifted, revealing the depth of darkness and the resilience of justice. She closed the journal, the final piece of a complex puzzle, and looked out toward the horizon. The game would continue, but so would she, always one step ahead, always watching, always ready. The first rays of sunlight spilled gently across the manicured lawns of Eastwood Manor, bathing the stately home in a soft golden glow that belied the storm it had weathered. The grand windows, once shadowed with secrets and sorrow, now reflected a fragile peace. Yet, as Dorothy Sayers stood at the manor's heavy front door, her figure silhouetted against the dawn, the tranquility felt incomplete, like the last note of a haunting melody hanging just beyond reach. She tightened the strap of her leather satchel, her keen eyes scanning the horizon where mist curled lazily above distant fields. The case that had consumed the manor's halls, and her own thoughts, had reached its tumultuous climax. The villain had slipped through their fingers, but the truth had been wrested from darkness, piece by painstaking piece. Justice was in motion, if not yet fully realized. Still a nagging sensation stirred in Dorothy's mind, one that had refused to fade amid the chaos. It was a minor detail, nearly dismissed amidst the weightier revelations, yet now it insisted upon attention. Her fingers absently traced the faint outline of a symbol she had noticed in passing, the delicate engraving on a small silver locket found among Evelyn Harrow's belongings. A pattern of interwoven vines twisted into an almost imperceptible shape resembling a serpent consuming its own tail, a symbol of infinity or perhaps a hidden message. She had inquired about it once, and Margaret Caldwell had claimed ignorance, brushing it off as a family heirloom of little consequence. But Dorothy sensed otherwise. The serpent, the cycle, the unending loop. It hinted at something deeper, a connection beyond the surface of this tragedy. As she turned away from the manor's imposing facade, footsteps echoed behind her. Jonathan Pierce approached, his expression weary but resolute. "Detective?" he said quietly. "Thank you for everything. Even if Edward Eastwood escaped, you gave us hope." Dorothy offered a faint smile. "Hope is often the beginning, Jonathan. The end comes only when we understand the full story." He hesitated, then added, "Do you think this is really over?" Her gaze drifted back to the manor, then toward the rising sun. "In my experience, mysteries never truly end, they merely evolve." A soft breeze stirred the autumn leaves at their feet, carrying with it a whisper of secrets yet untold. As Dorothy stepped onto the winding path that led away from Eastwood Manor, the locket's symbol etched itself deeper into her thoughts. Somewhere in the shadows of the past and the faint edges of the present, a new story awaited, one that would test her wit, courage, and resolve anew. She walked steadily into the morning, the weight of unanswered questions both a burden and a beacon. For a detective like Dorothy Sayers, the pursuit of truth was never ending, and that was just the way she preferred it.